I fell in love with this dress when I came across Los Feliz shop in 2017. The shop owner Nadia has kept many of the items she has already sold up on the website as a kind of archive, so this dress had already been sold, unfortunately, when I was browsing the online shop. It's vintage Moschino, a piece from one of the diffusion lines that looks to be from the late 90s or early aughts. I've been obsessed with it ever since and have consistently looked to see if it has popped up on any secondhand sites. I have search alerts, notifications on multiple sites, and I manually do a search for it at least once a month. So it's not an understatement to say that I'm obsessed with this dress. While it looks like a very basic dress, I think there are some details that make it really special. The low rounded neck, the low back, the little lettuce hem detail, the fit, and the beautiful color. It's described as body hugging, which is a really apt description. I would agree that it's body hugging and not body con. You can tell it was cut to kind of skim the body, and the choice of the fabric really elevates the dress. This is just an aside. If you enjoy vintage, Nadia creates really thoughtful, beautiful collections. I think she keeps everything really reasonably priced for the quality of design that she offers. She also runs weekly sales on Instagram. I've purchased a lot of items from her site and also the Instagram sales over the last few years. She used to have a studio which I was able to visit a couple of years ago. She has since opened up a beautiful shop in Barcelona with her friend, which I hope I can visit sometime in the near future. I'm just a really big fan of her work. This is a pure recommendation of a special place on the internet. I finally attempted to make this dress in 2021, but I ultimately wasn't happy with it, and making it actually broke my sewing machine. I sold it as a sample on Depop or my website, I can't remember which. Since then, I still haven't found it, and I want to give making it a second try. The fabric choice is really important, and for me, getting a color that is close to the original is a priority. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to find something that I imagine would be the perfect dupe. It looks like a rayon or viscose knit fabric, and in these photos it looks like a pale but bright matcha. In the others it looks like a pale fluorescent yellow-green. When I first made this dress, I had spent several hours over the span of a few days looking for something that was close to the drape and color, and I ended up finding this modal spandex blend from a seller on Etsy. I like that the seller usually drapes his fabric over the mannequins, so you can get a better idea of how sheer the fabric is and how it falls and drapes. This color matches the pale fluorescent neon the dress appears in some of the photos. I bought a few yards of it, and I still have enough to try making another dress. This fabric is so soft. I'd love to make something else from it. It has a slight sheen to it. The color is fantastic. It shows up a little bit more like a pale neon yellow in my video, but in real life you can definitely see the green in it. The only thing is, I think it's a lot lighter in weight than the fabric of the Moschino dress. If the fabric is draped over something that has contrasting colors, it's very clear that the fabric is sheer. The sheerness is really only an issue when there's a lot of contrast. So here it is draped on me while I'm wearing dark clothing. So if you wear underwear that matches your skin color, it's not a huge problem. The problem is finding a bra or bralette on top to wear with this dress, and I'm not a fan of pasties. I don't have an issue with wearing sheer clothing, bra or no bra, but there's a time and place for everything. And just to lend this dress more versatility so I can feel comfortable wearing it for multiple different occasions, if I'm using this fabric, I want a lining to increase the opacity just a little bit. Of course, you can also play around with the sheerness and wear contrasting undergarments, and I can see that being cute too. For me, with this dress, I don't want to think too much about styling it when I wear it in the future, so the baseline for me is, can I throw it on without also having to think about styling my underwear? Of course, now with the lining, I have another thing that I have to look for solely through the internet. And of course, as you start to add more components, you start changing the look of the dress a little bit. I considered just lining the dress with the same fabric so that the dress is made of 2 layers of this fabric. And at the time of this recording, If the lining that I purchase ends up not working out, I might just do that. So the lining that I'm considering is a silk georgette or a similar type of fabric. The reason being is that I thought a silk sort of georgette would feel nice and help to absorb sweat if I'm wearing it out on a hot summer day. I started looking on Google. This is a way that I like to start my fabric searches, is to just use Google image search. I found this website that sells silk georgette in beautiful green colors, and I love this type of bright green, but I'm not going to pay that much for fabric that I'm just going to use as lining. But I did already add one of these as a swatch. Anyways, it's always hard for me to stay focused when I'm fabric shopping in store or online. I start seeing fabrics and start imagining future projects. But staying focused this time, I very fortunately found this eBay listing for not only a georgette-like fabric, but one that's in a fluorescent green color that has stretch. I thought I might have to cut any fabric that I ended up buying on the bias, which requires even more fabric, in order to have some give to match the stretch of the outer fabric. But this looks perfect. This looks like, depending on how much stretch, I might not have to cut it on the bias, which will, of course, save me fabric. The color looks potentially a little bit more green than the modal that I already have. I always appreciate when sellers provide a lot of pertinent information because it makes shopping for things like fabric a lot easier because you have a good idea about what to expect after you make your purchase. I ended up buying the 5-yard bundle and I paid about $22, almost $22 after taxes and shipping. I just got the fabric and I don't think I will be using it. It would have worked as a lining. You can see if I layer the modal fabric over it, you can't really see the contrast underneath anymore compared to layering the modal directly on top of my dark top and shorts. The georgette is a lime green that's just like a hint too dark. It's so pretty though, so I'll definitely be able to use it for some other projects since I have so much of it. I tend to overthink some things and overlook others. It's a constant balance. I needed to buy some matching thread for this fabric. The fabric you're working with will impact the type of thread and needle you will need to use. The two fabrics I will be working with are lightweight stretch fabrics, and I will likely need a stretch needle for this. I found this matching thread, which has a weight of 40. The weight is basically the thickness of the thread, which needs to be the correct weight for the weight of your fabric. You wouldn't want to use something that's too thin or something that's too thick either. I think 40 and 50 weight threads are kind of considered all-purpose sized thread, but I'm double checking. So the seller described the fabric as being 9.5 ounces. On this chart, 9.5 ounces is a medium to heavy fabric. That's not how I would describe this fabric whatsoever. So I ended up measuring a scrap of the fabric that I had, calculated the area, and I used this online calculator to figure out if the fabric is actually 9.5 ounces. So according to this calculator, a 9.5 ounce fabric should be equivalent to 322 grams per square meter. For the size of the scrap, that means the scrap should weigh 157.4 grams. They have a conversion that you can use here, and that converts 157.4 grams to 5.55 ounces. I weighed the scrap. It weighs 3.4 ounces, so it's definitely not a 9.5 ounce fabric. 3.4 ounce is 61.3% of 5.55 ounces, so that means that the fabric is actually a 5.8 ounce fabric. Checking the chart again, that would mean that this is a lightweight fabric, which I would agree with. According to the chart, a thread of text 24, 27, and 30 would be appropriate for working with this fabric, and they also have recommended needle sizes. The website where I am getting the thread from also has a tab where they recommend a needle size, and here they recommend a needle size of size 80. Different brands in different countries will provide the weight of the thread using different systems, unfortunately. I'm using this conversion chart to help me figure out what text 24, 27, and 30 would be equivalent to in weight. Doing the conversion means that weights 42 to 33 would work well with the fabric. 40 falls within that range, so I have my thread. I already said that I will be using a stretch needle for this project. For 40 weight thread, Schmetz recommends a needle of size 80. They only sell the stretch needles in a size 75 and 90. And just a brief note, the second number that follows 75 and 80 is just the needle sizing in a different metric. I know, confusing. If I have time, I might put together a spreadsheet that has all this basic information compiled with some calculators so I don't have to look up a bunch of different websites before I start a project, and I'll share that if I end up doing it. So thread, check, needle, check. The last thing is the bias trim. During my first attempt at making this dress, I finished the hem at the neckline by binding it with a very thin strip of the same fabric. This time around, I want to use a non-stretch fabric to really maintain the length of the neckline. Using a non-stretch bias might help the neckline from stretching out too much and become misshapen over time. So off I went to look for some bias tape. There were lots of good options from sellers on Etsy in Europe and Australia, but none really from US sellers. I finally settled on Wright's bias tape in Citron. This is a polyester cotton blend from a brand that I always see in fabric stores. I was considering the lime green because it looked like a good match in some photos, but hesitated because it looked too green in other photos. I finally checked out an Etsy listing where the seller had photographed all the different colors together, and Citron just stuck out as the most appropriate choice. Here it is next to the lime green. I ended up getting a wider bias strip with the thought that I can basically trim it myself and then refold the new strips. So let's study the dress a little bit. I've zoomed in on these blurry seams so many times. The dress has sleeves that look like longer cap sleeves with, of course, the cute lettuce hem detail. You can see that they're also acting as the shoulder straps, as the top panel, well, the back panels don't go all the way up to the shoulders. On the back, the scoop goes really, really low. There are these two small side panels and finally the skirt panel. So far we have two sleeves, two small back panels, and a back skirt panel. On the front, we have the top panel sewn to the bottom skirt panel just a few inches below the bust. So 2 panels there, so altogether 7 panels total. I wanted to be extra and draw the dress figure. I just followed a tutorial on YouTube to draw it. I'll link that tutorial somewhere here and down below if you want to practice as well. I said I was being extra, but this practice actually had a purpose to help me determine what I need to improve on and do differently compared to what I did with the first iteration. So I'll be drafting some longer cap sleeves, and we'll have 2 of those. I'll have to draft the top part of the front piece and a panel for the front of the skirt. The first time I did this, I cut this more bodycon than body hugging. Bodycon pieces are usually cut so that they are very form-fitting on the body. When I first made this dress, I cut the dress slightly wider at the bust and then made the waist the size of my waist. And I think this resulted in the top being too loose, and the overall effect was a defined waist that detracted from the overall fit. What I'm planning on doing this time is to cut the panels so that they match my bust and hip measurements, but I'll add at least a couple of inches to the waist. At this point, I don't know how the lining will change the draping of the main fabric, but I'm hoping it won't change it dramatically so that I can just let the fabric do most of the work of draping and shaping around this area. I'm keeping the lining fairly simple with a single panel on the front and another single panel for the back. It will be really important to cut the lining so that it matches the outer fabric's dimensions perfectly in order to minimize the lining from bunching up and then having that bunching show up on the top fabric. I'm going to cut the lining a little bit longer and see what that looks like after I baste it. Maybe I will end up just cutting it slightly shorter or the same length as the outer fabric. I'm not settled on the idea of including the lining material on the sleeves, but I will be cutting them as well and seeing what they look like with basting. Drawing this out is helpful to understand how these small panels on the back came to be. The back goes quite low, and you can see we go down past where that front seam would hit if we had made a single back top panel. Because it goes so low, we end up with these two small back panels and then the single skirt piece. Then there's the lining piece, and that's the construction of the dress. Oops, I forgot to mention, of course, there is the very thin, very minimal bias trim and some ties in the back that are most likely also made from the same bias tape. Those ties in the back are actually very important because the neckline is so wide, the sleeves that are also acting as the shoulder straps tend to fall off your shoulders, so you need the ties to keep them in place. I don't currently have a bodice sloper, so I used a body skimming shirt to help me draft a pattern. This shirt fits me perfectly without being too skin tight. Save for the neckline, I thought the shirt had a very similar fit to the top of the dress. Additionally, it's quite long, reaching just before my hips, which I thought would also help me when I drafted the dress by tracing the shirt. I use washi tape to roughly mark the neckline and the shoulders. For such a low neckline, I think it's a good idea to make the neckline a centimeter or two higher than where you think it will hit, just in case it actually ends up sitting lower. I think this is really important with very drapey and stretchy fabrics. For drafting, you're going to need some rulers, a measuring tape, a French curve, and this other curved ruler. I started by basically tracing my shirt and then marked where I had placed the washi tape. I also drew a center line down the shirt and used the rulers and the curve tools to make a more defined pattern. You can see I'm trying to make very subtle curves at the waist. I chose to work on only one half. The body was fairly easy to draft because it's a very basic silhouette, and essentially the back and the front are the same except the scoop goes very low on the back. Once I positioned the seam under the bust and drew the scooped back, the pattern was pretty much finished. I actually managed to find the pattern that I drafted in 2021. At that time I had a sloper, and look at all this math. I'm actually surprised that my markings are pretty close to what I drew the very first time. The major difference is in the waist. You can see how small I made it, and you can also kind of see that I made the bust a little bit wider on the original draft as well. The skirt was also more narrow at the bottom. This time around, I tried to keep it a little bit straighter for the skirt. The toughest pieces to draft were surprisingly the sleeves. When I made the pattern this time, I felt like the sleeves ended up being too small and too short. So I drafted and cut a few different sleeves, but I didn't like any of them. So what I actually did was go back to the 2021 sleeve pattern. The reason why was that it actually resulted in a good shoulder length. I also thought that sleeve was too tight. So what I did was take the original sleeve pattern and slashed and spread the pattern to create a flutter sleeve. Because I went ahead with using the same fabric for the lining, I decided to cut out only a single back panel and a single front panel. I wanted to reduce the amount of work and keep it as simple as possible. So that's why I didn't cut all the 5 different pieces that I used for the outer top part. I also thought that using just 2 panels for the lining would minimize potentially bulky seams on the front and back where they theoretically would sit on top of each other had I made the outer and inner dresses exactly alike. Before I started with the pieces that I cut for the dress, I sewed a bunch of scrap pieces of fabric to figure out the best machine settings. In the end, I reduced the presser foot pressure from the default 5 to 1. I reduced the top thread tension by a little bit, so I just turned the dial from the default setting to -1. I of course switched to the stretch needle. I also have this brother walking foot because I previously had a brother sewing machine, and I did put it onto the Juki, but I don't know if it's a perfect fit, so it's unclear if it actually did anything. So when I started sewing, I thought it would be nice to use an overlocking stitch to stitch together the front and back panels by stitching over the overlapped seam allowances. Before I started sewing with the machine, I base stitched the two panels together. And I recommend that you do this for every single seam when you work with such a lightweight fabric. Yes, it adds more time, but it's definitely worth it. For me, I found it easiest to handle the fabric by laying it on the floor and working on it as close to a flat surface as possible. The reason being is that this fabric just stretches very, very easily under its own weight. At this point, I tried on the lining and it looked good. Again, the tricky thing about working with this fabric is that it has no structure and the front was being pulled down by the weight of the fabric. I had to kind of trust that the neckline would sit where I intended it to sit once it was stabilized by the bias trim. I found that the fabric was just too lightweight for the machine even after all these changes, and it was being eaten constantly at the feed dogs, especially at the beginning of the seams. So I found out that using tissue paper helped stabilize the fabric a lot. It may look like I'm pulling pretty hard on the fabric here, but I was actually being quite gentle. Because I decided to base stitch the seam allowance so that they would overlap, I ended up creating a tube that I had to sew through, which is why there is so much fabric around the needle and the machine here. I was just making sure that nothing was getting caught and that the fabric was laying flat as it was being stitched. So when I actually put the two panels on the machine, I only used tissue paper at the very beginning and the end of the seam. But if I could go back in time, I would have used it for the entire seam. I also would not have used this technique where I was using this overlocking stitch on overlapping seam allowances. It actually doesn't look super neat if the stitch doesn't perfectly capture the exposed edge of the fabric. Also, I did the math wrong. If I wanted to use this technique, I should have added seam allowances to only one panel, the front or the back. Because I added seam allowances to all four edges and overlapped them, I actually made the dress a little bit wider than I had intended to by about 1/2 inch, which isn't the end of the world. I cut out the remaining pieces of the dress and assembled the pieces of the front of the dress. I actually added this water-soluble thread to make me feel like the shipping fee I paid for the Wonderfield thread purchase was worth it. I realized that I could have used it earlier when I sewed the lining together to save me the trouble of pulling out the basting stitch. Basically, this thread dissolves when it comes into contact with water. This time around, for the outer dress, I decided to use this variation of an overlock stitch, which may be available on your regular sewing machine too. I found some tissue paper and used it to sew all along the seams, and I was very happy with the results. After tearing away the tissue paper, I trimmed the seam allowance about 2 to 3 millimeters away from the stitch. Once I had the front and back panels assembled, I put them on top of each other and then base stitched them together. I didn't perfectly measure my seam allowances, I just eyeballed them, so it's completely my fault that the under bust seam didn't end up matching on the front and the back. Please be better than me and measure and cut out your seam allowances with care. I folded the sleeve and sewed the very short bottom seam which goes underneath the armpit. What I'm trying to demonstrate here is that I base stitched the resulting seam allowance towards the back of the sleeves. The armhole length is slightly different for the front and back, so the sleeves do have a front and back to match the lengths of the seam allowance of the armpit or the arm of the dress. After I machine stitched the sleeves to the dress, I tried the dress on again. I don't have footage of this, but I found that there was a little bit of excess fabric on the chest from the sleeves. The part I color in black in the drawing is supposed to illustrate where and how much of the sleeves I ended up trimming off before I attached the bias tape. I base stitched the entire neckline. Doing this helps to keep everything in place, especially important because I do have a lining here, but it also reduces the stretching when you're handling the fabric. I used a tape measure to figure out the length of the bias tape that I would need to completely go around the neckline. I ended up getting the Citron double folded bias tape from Joann's, and I didn't think that I would be lucky enough that they would be an exact match, so I wasn't expecting that. But when it did arrive, I thought that the color was very well suited to the color of the dress. So for me, it was a match in that regard. I cut the bias tape in half because I wanted a very narrow trim. So you can make your own, or you can buy a 1/4 inch or a 6mm tape. That'll work too. So after cutting the bias tape in half, I ironed them flat, and I have these tools to help you fold bias tape. If you just search for a bias tape toolkit, you should be able to find them. And I like this because you can actually use the awl as a sewing stiletto, so it's actually a 2-for-1. I started attaching the tape near the armpit on the back. I clipped the tape all along the neckline before I started base stitching, and before I started sewing on the machine, I had to change the thread tension back to the default position, and I chose a short straight stitch to attach the bias trim. Then I machine stitched on the first fold of the bias tape closest to the raw edge. If I could do this again, I would have sewn just next to the fold, closer to the raw edge. This way, when I folded the tape over to the back, I can create an even more narrow trim and better ensure that I will catch the back of the trim when I top stitch over the bias trim on the front of the dress. It was midnight at this point and I was super tired, but I really wanted to finish. That was a big mistake. I top stitched, but I ended up missing a few segments in the back, so I had to go back over those areas. My straight stitches were too short for me to feel confident that I could seam rip them without damaging and stretching out the neckline. So make sure you also base stitch the back if you want to better ensure a cleaner finish. I attached the back ties when I was top stitching the bias trim. I placed the ties about 3 inches beyond the point of my shoulder toward the back. I tried on the dress and decided that I wanted the top of the dress to be shorter than the lining by about 3 inches. I evened out the bottom of the lining before moving a ruler along that bottom hem to mark 3 inches just above that on the top layer. I trimmed the top layer and was finally ready to finish the lettuce hem at 1 in the morning. Making a lettuce trim is really easy without a serger. I rolled the raw hem up and inside the dress by about 1 centimeter. I settled on a width of 4 millimeters and a height of 0.8 millimeter. I sewed with the wrong side of the fabric facing upward so that I could see the edge of the hem that was folded on the wrong side of the fabric. I placed the fabric underneath the presser foot, put the needle down into the fabric, and stretched the fabric in front of and behind the needle using both of my hands. The zigzag stitch should go off the edge of your folded hem. Once I made it all the way around the hem, I went back over at least the first 2 inches of the zigzag stitches before stopping and cutting my thread. You can go over the entire hem if you'd like. The more you stretch the fabric and the slower that you pull the fabric through the machine, the curlier the lettuce hem will be. As long as you are holding the fabric taut, the machine will not be able to eat your fabric even though it is a delicate fabric. I repeated this process for the top layer and the sleeves. What I'm doing in this poorly filmed clip is cutting away the excess fabric from the lettuce trim. I'm actually really surprised that I managed to do this without cutting holes in the fabric. When I woke up in the morning and measured the difference between the top and the bottom layers of the dress, I found that the hems were different by actually 7 inches, so I don't know how that happened. I blame that on sewing at 1 a.m. in the morning. And here's the finished dress. I think this is a major improvement from the first attempt. I'm really happy with it. I only wish I had marked my seam allowance instead of eyeballing it and rested more so that I had energy to base stitch everything. The outer dress ended up being a little bit smaller than the lining around the skirt, but I actually liked the very subtle ruffling that created on the lining that is exposed. I hadn't intended on trimming the outer dress so short, but I also liked the bigger difference in the lengths. Here are some ways that I would wear the dress. This dress pretty much does everything for you. I did try to show some layering options, but I like it best on its own. Like I said, the silhouette is pretty basic, so I find it's quite easy to dress up or down. I hate picking shoes, but in this case I found that pretty much any shoe I pulled out went well with the dress. I attempted to make a sewing pattern if anyone is interested. There's a link in the description where you can download the pattern and the separate instructions. I don't have any experience making patterns and even less experience grading a pattern. I checked the measurements of these patterns with other size charts, and I think if you take your normal size, the dress will be quite form-fitting. You may consider sizing up if you want a less bodycon fit. Of course, the sizing is then even more limited. Because the silhouette is so basic, it probably will be easy to modify the patterns to better suit your body. I'm trying to find some good resources to start learning about how to grade patterns, so hopefully I can do better in the future. I may revise the pattern if I have that opportunity to learn more. Also, the dress is drafted on me, so it's made for someone with a small bust. You may find it necessary to add more fabric to the top if you need more coverage. Anyways, I hope this was kind of interesting to see my thought process and how I work when I sew. Bye! Remember to base stitch everything. Here's additional footage that I hope will clarify some things for people who are interested in making the dress. Here I used a piece of thread to mark the front of the sleeves to help me correctly put together the dress. You can use whatever you like to make sure that you can tell what is front and what is back. You'll see me going over the stitches, but I actually don't recommend doing that, especially if you're using the same overlock stitch that I did, because it's pretty hard to pick that stitch apart. Again, here is the front of the sleeve, and I'm going to base stitch the seam allowance toward the back of the sleeve. With the right sides of the fabric touching, I matched the side seam at the armpit on the dress with the seam of the bottom of the sleeves. I base stitch working from this seam outwards so that I have two separate base stitches, both starting from that armpit seam. When I put this piece on the machine to sew, I also start from that seam. It's easier to make sure all the seams are aligned this way. Now it's time to attach the bias trim. Once again, we're going to base stitch. If you're doing a lining, I would recommend base stitching the outer part and the lining together before you baste the bias tape on top of all of that. If you have just a single layer of fabric, you should be fine without stay stitching the knit fabric. You just have to be careful not to stretch the fabric as you're going around the neckline. You may find clipping the bias tape around the neckline to be helpful if you choose to base stitch this way. This is just for illustrative purposes, so imagine that my tape went all the way around. Once the tape reaches the beginning again, I mark where the two meet on the end of the tape. Then I mark 1 centimeter and 2 centimeters further down. I then go to the beginning of the tape and I mark 1 centimeter down from where the tape starts. Use something that won't be visible after you're done sewing. Here I'm using a pen so that you can see where I make the markings. You can now cut the end of the tape at the 2 centimeter mark. I found it easier to fold and then iron the two ends of the tape at the 1 centimeter mark. The folds should be lined up together and then straight stitched together. After stitching the two ends together, I iron the seam flat and trim it to about 3 millimeters. Now I take this to the machine to straight stitch along that first fold. Before I start base stitching the back of the bias tape, I'm going to make the ties. One end of the tie will be sewn into the bias trim, so I don't worry about that end so much. On the other side, the exposed end, I clipped the edge at an angle. I opened it up and clipped the edges of the folds inside and folded the triangle onto the inside of the trim. In this example, I made very small folds along the diagonals of that triangle before folding everything into the tape. I clipped it to keep everything in place. I start sewing on the end that will be hidden in the neckline. I find it helpful to put some tissue paper here. I also don't necessarily start right at the beginning of the tape. You might find it easier to place the tape so that you can grab a bit of it after the presser foot and pull to keep the fabric taut and prevent it from being eaten at the feed dogs. I had some issues where the tape got stuck in the walking foot. When I get close to the exposed end, where I can't really hold onto that part that's being fed past the needle, I found it helpful to insert tissue paper underneath the bias tape to prevent it from being eaten up by the feed dogs. Once I reach the end of the long side of the tape, I rotate the trim to go down the very short edge. I then rotate the trim again to go back toward the long edge diagonally, and then back tack or reverse stitch over that. I used a loop of thread on a needle to pull the thread through the middle of the bias tape before snipping it. I place the tie almost 3 inches beyond the point of my shoulder toward the back. I recommend attaching the ties anywhere between 1 and 3 inches beyond the shoulder toward the back. Mark where the ties will go. You can also clip them in position. I snipped the end of the ties that will go into the bias trim close to the beginning of the stitches. Then I position the tie like so. You can see that it's pointing into the dress. At this point, you guessed it, base stitch all the way around the neckline. Finally, top stitch with the machine. Go slowly over bulky areas. Hopefully, because you base stitch, you didn't miss any of the back. Now to finish the trim and tie, you're going to fold the tie over the bias tape and press the tie so that it maintains that fold. Go over the tie with stitches starting a few millimeters above and below the tie. I would experiment with using a very short zigzag stitch to secure the ties. Work carefully so that your stuff looks better than mine. Let me know how it goes if you try it.